All right, so we've got a lot to cover over the next 60 to 90 minutes. So I just want to set the stage for what we're going to be discussing. So first, in our first part, we'll talk about, first of all, who WRI is if you're not familiar with us. And then we'll also go over the Global Food Loss and Waste Challenge. We'll go over then what 10 by 20 by 30 is all about, and then get into some discussion of target setting and measurement. So lots to cover. We'll have lots of opportunities for question and answers throughout, and we will be sending out the recording and the slides. Once we've concluded all of the training modules, we've got one more of those to do. So by the end of the month, we'll be sending out all of the slides and the recordings, and you can also contact me for receiving those sooner. So without further ado, I'm just going to launch right into the first section about us, WRI, as an organization, and about why food loss and waste is such an important issue. So first, about WRI. So for those of you who are not familiar with WRI, we are a global research organization focused on the intersection of environment and development and human well-being. And so our global office is based in Washington, D.C. That's where I am speaking to you from today, but we have offices in every populated continent except for Australia. And so you can see we truly are a global initiative, and the participants in this conversation are truly globally representative as well. We have, again, participants from every continent. So that's very exciting that this is truly a global initiative and something that has the potential to reach quite a lot of people. And a little more about us as an organization. We work on an array of issues, not just food, but we have 7 major focus programs: food, forests, water, oceans, cities, climate, and energy. I think that was 7. And so, but specifically on food systems, we're very focused on food loss and waste as a part of that. So we have served as the secretariat of the Food Loss and Waste Protocol, which is a multi-stakeholder partnership that developed the Global Food Loss and Waste Accounting and Reporting Standard, which some of you I'm sure are already familiar with, and some of you are probably not. So we will be discussing that in a little more detail later on. We're the Secretariat for Champions 12.3, which is a coalition of executives from the public and private sectors that have all committed to having food loss and waste by 2030 and achieving Sustainable Development Goal Target 12.3, which again, we will also be talking about in a little more detail. And finally, we are the authors of a number of leading publications on this topic, most recently one called Reducing Food Loss and Waste, Setting a Global Action Agenda. So I'm going to start by setting the stage of what the Global Food Loss and Waste Challenge is and why it's such an important issue. Some of this, for those of you who have been in this space for a while, will be stuff you've heard many, many times. So no worries if you've already heard this. We'll just be sort of setting the stage so that everyone's on the same page. So in terms of the scale of the Food Loss and Waste Challenge, about 1/3 of all food is lost or wasted each year, according to FAO estimates. And that food loss and waste costs the global economy about $940 billion each year. And then the associated greenhouse gas emissions with all of that food that is either lost or wasted totals up to about 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Just to put that in a little further context, if we're a country, if you had sort of food waste nation, it would be the world's 3rd largest greenhouse gas emitter after China and the United States. And so the scale of the challenge is that the world throws out about 1 billion tons of food each year, while 1 in 9 people globally remain malnourished. And this isn't to say that if we reduce food loss and waste, that magically it will be redistributed to those who need it, but it is sort of a striking tension of the fact that some people don't have enough to eat, while in other places we aren't making the best use of our food. And as you've probably seen, COVID-19 has led food loss and waste to be even more in the news than usual, and really highlighted the importance of tackling this topic. So you've heard the stories of dumped milk and vegetables being plowed under and workers getting sick in factories. And so this all highlights issues with the food system at large and specifically on food loss and waste. So just to give a few statistics about where food loss and waste takes place and how it manifests in different parts of the world. In this chart, you can see that how in each region of the world, how food loss and waste breaks down by stage in the supply chain. And so you can see in regions like North America and Europe and industrialized Asia, you tend to have more of the food loss and waste occurring in the consumption side of the food supply chain, those reddish pinkish bars at the top. Whereas in regions like South and Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, it's occurring much earlier in the food supply chain at the production and handling and storage levels. So although the end result is the same, which is that food intended for human consumption leaves the human food supply chain, it manifests very differently depending on what part of the world you're in. In terms of types of food that get lost or wasted, if you're looking at it by weight, you end up with fruits and vegetables being the highest percentage of which commodity is lost or wasted most frequently. That's in large part due to the high water content of fruits and vegetables. If you were to look at this same figure and look at it by calories, for example, or energy content, you would end up with cereals being a much larger percentage because of the high caloric density of cereals. And then if you were looking at it in terms of environmental impacts or greenhouse gas emissions, you would probably end up with meat and milk having a much larger portion of the pie because of the high environmental impacts associated with meat and milk production. So just to say that it really depends on what you're interested in, what you're looking at, that this figure can go a few different ways. So why should you seek to reduce food loss and waste? Well, one reason is that the Sustainable Development Goals, which were adopted by the United Nations 5 years ago, I believe, have set out a series of goals and targets that seek to address a number of human development issues, one of them being what's on the screen, SDG Target 12.3, within the Responsible Consumption and Production Goal. And this goal says that by 2030, we want to have per capita food loss and waste at the retail and consumer levels and reduce food loss along the entire supply chain. And so why is this a goal that we want to do? Why is this beneficial? Well, from a social perspective, you improve food security for a growing population. And again, if that food can be redistributed to those who need it, you can help feed hungry people. From an environmental perspective, you conserve natural resources and contribute to reducing climate change. And from an economic perspective, it's really a core element of business that you want to increase efficiency and avoid unnecessary costs. And in many cases, reducing food loss and waste leads to that increase in efficiency and even can generate new revenue sources. I'm seeing that chat coming in. Yes, so someone just messaged me about the slides. We will be sending the slides after the event. Again, we have one more of these webinars to run, and then we'll be sending them to all of the 10 by 20 by 30 participants. But my email address will come up on the screen later on. And if you would like to have the slides sooner, you can send me an email. And so getting back to that last point about the economic benefits. So in 2017, WRI and our colleagues at WRAP in the UK, we quantified the business case for companies. And we looked at over 700 companies across 1,200 sites across 17 countries and looked at the effectiveness of various food loss and waste reduction measures. And what we found was that 99% of sites had a positive return on their investment. And the median return for every dollar invested was that $14 were found in return. So a 14-to-1 return on an investment based on a number of possible interventions and results. So we'll talk more, we'll give some more concrete examples as we move along, but just to show that, you know, reducing food loss and waste, it's great that it has social and environmental benefits, and certainly that is very important, but even if you only care about the bottom dollar, it makes sense to invest in food loss and waste reduction. So just some strategies for how we go about doing this and really setting the stage for how we're going to frame the approach in 10 by 20 by 30. We like to look at it from a target, measure, act approach. So what that means is, first, you set the target because targets set ambition and ambition motivates action. So in this case, we have the target provided to us from SDG 12.3 already. It's that 50% reduction by 2030. This probably sounds like a lot. It is a lot, and it's very ambitious. But what we're finding is that this ambitious target truly does compel companies to get creative and find new solutions that end up being beneficial, not just for reducing food waste, but for their businesses as well. So we'll go over some of those examples soon, but I just want to say that in many cases, we're finding that companies that have only put 2 or 3 years of effort into reducing food loss and waste are already experiencing reductions of 30 to 40%. So the goal is ambitious, but it's doable and it's achievable. Measurement. What gets measured gets managed. That's a famous phrase coined by this fellow on the slide, Peter Drucker, a famous business consultant. And we're going to talk a lot about measurement later on. And the reason for this is that measurement really helps you to understand what's happening with food loss and waste within your operations. It helps you to understand the size of the opportunity. It helps you to identify hotspots where action will be most meaningful and therefore prioritize action. And then it helps you to track progress so that when you're taking action and taking steps to reduce food loss and waste, you are able to see over time if your actions have been effective. And it also helps to know how far along you are in terms of meeting that target. So this slide is just showing you that there's a huge amount of companies and organizations that are setting targets and measuring. And this isn't even exhaustive. So some of your companies where you might have already been doing this, and if you're not on here, I apologize, but this isn't even an exhaustive set of logos. It's just to give the sense of, you're not going this alone. This isn't something that is really putting you out there on a limb. This is more and more becoming the norm. And finally, what ultimately matters is action. So based on what you learn from conducting measurements and scoping out what's happening within your organization, you can then take action. And this can really take a number of forms. It could take the form of redistributing food to food banks and those who need it. It could be about diverting loss and waste to animal feed or to new products. It could be about training staff to handle food more effectively. It could be about changing the way you order food. There's so many ways to take action, and it really depends a lot on what you learn in that measurement step. So I will pause here to take a drink of water and let anyone ask any questions in the chat if you have any to this point. All right, I'm not seeing anything at the moment, so we have 3 more Q&A pauses, so no worries if you didn't get one out right this moment. But now I'm going to go a little more into 10 by 20 by 30 as an initiative. So the vision of 10 by 20 by 30 is to massively increase private sector contribution to the global goal of reducing food loss and waste by catalyzing efforts up the supply chain. And so what that means is that it's an initiative where at least 10 of the world's largest food retailers, which you'll see on the right, those food retailers and providers, they've all committed to following the Target Measure Act approach, and they've asked you, their suppliers, to do the same, thereby having their food loss and waste by 2030. And so you'll see that there are actually 12 of those large food retailers and providers, not just 10. We started with just 10, ended up having more join, and 10 by 20 by 30 just sounds better than 12 by 20 by 30. But we're excited that that is the case, that we've had even more interest than we initially anticipated. And so why is this important? So in this case, what we're hoping to achieve is having a bit of a domino effect where we can work with just those retailers, but then what makes this really special is that the retailers then have reached out to you all, their priority suppliers, to take part as well, and to really create almost an exponential growth effect where we'll be reaching out to more and more countries via these relationships. And so it catalyzes that whole chain approach, trying to get not just the waste that's happening at the retail and food service level, but getting into that upstream food loss and waste reduction as well. And so again, you can see who's involved right on the slide. And so this is an approach that has a proven track record, because we've seen this work with Tesco, who pioneered this approach with their suppliers, who are seen on the slides, back in 2017. And so Tesco, the UK-based retailer, was one of the first food companies to publicly report their food loss and waste data, and then they reached out to their suppliers and asked them to do the same. And they have already seen some very large reductions from their participants. So here's what we're asking of participants in 10 by 20 by 30. We're asking you to follow that Target Measure Act approach by first setting the target of a 50% reduction of food loss and waste within your company by 2030. Measure your base year and the progress thereafter, and share those results publicly. And then to take action to reduce food loss and waste. And as I said, that could take a number of forms: trainings, new technologies, changed practices, changed processes, or other innovations. Of course, we wouldn't ask something so significant of you without an equally significant offer. And so here's what the offer is for participants in 10 by 20 by 30. We'll be providing these structured training seminars. Every couple months, we'll have a webinar that will cover a new set of topics. I'll show those topics on the next slide. We'll have online office hours where you can come and just ask any questions that are on your mind. And right now, it's not looking likely that we'll be having in-person group convenings, at least certainly not in the US. But if that becomes an option again, we may have in-person group convenings. We'll be providing guidance on a wide array of topics, things like the business case, how to overcome initial inertia, setting your scope, how to measure. And we'll be providing a simple template for uploading the results and enabling aggregation across 10 by 20 by 30. We'll give deep insight into strategies and tactics for reducing food loss and waste. And those won't just be coming from us at WRI, but they'll be coming from your peers who have already tackled food loss and waste and experienced significant benefits from it. And so you'll have access to food loss and waste reduction experts, practitioners from peer companies, and written case examples. And finally, you'll be able to reap the benefits of reducing food loss and waste within your own operations. And so those are what we mentioned earlier, those economic, social, and environmental benefits, as well as just the good public and media profile that comes from doing something like this. People don't like waste. They don't like wasted food, especially. So it's seen very positively when a company decides to take this sort of step. So the added benefit of all of this is that you're not going on the journey alone. You're not doing this just out on a limb. You are going on the journey with 200 of your peers. And just to be clear about this, because this is a question that's come up, we're not asking for any money from you. There's no cost for participating in 10 by 20 by 30. This is really just about trying to catalyze larger action. So here's the timeline and the resources for participants. We'll be doing a series of these trainings. There are 5 training modules scheduled currently. The first is the one we're doing right now, getting started in setting your scope. The next one over the next 2 months will be on quantification methods and examples of how you go about using them. In November, we'll go over some responses to questions that come up about measurement and data. At the end of this year and the beginning of next, we'll talk more about developing reduction strategies and provide a lot of case examples for that. And then as we get into the early part of next year, we'll go over how you assess progress over time and refine those strategies based on your initial results. And then this last item here, where it says sector-specific trainings and webinars, the idea here is that if it turns out there are companies within a specific sector that are experiencing unique challenges to their sector, we may convene all of them for a discussion about how to address those challenges. So for example, if the dairy sector, if there are enough dairy companies who are experiencing challenges unique to the dairy sector, we might just have a dairy specific training to go over those challenges. Another sort of component of this is that there are companies who have been asked to be involved who are already taking a lot of action on food loss and waste and who are maybe further along than what will be covered by these training modules. In those cases, if there's enough interest, we may convene sort of a more advanced group of companies to really get into the nitty-gritty about how you get into that last sort of 10% to achieve the goal. So that's something where if you do feel like you've already covered a lot of this material and you're already further along on your food loss and waste journey, please let me know and we can talk about convening that more advanced group. So again, the other guidance here is those open office hours webinars, an email inbox. If you reach out to us, we will strive to get back to you within 48 hours. And you can contact me, Brian Lipinski, or my colleague Kai, who will be speaking shortly with any of your questions or requests. And so just to give you a sense of what the next sort of public-facing component of 10 by 20 by 30 is, Champions 12.3, that group of executives I referred to earlier, holds an annual event during UN General Assembly Week in late September due to the link with the SDGs. Normally that event takes place in New York City. This year it will be held virtually because of the coronavirus on September 24th. And we want to announce all the participants in 10 by 20 by 30 at that event. And so we're planning to conduct media outreach globally as well as support your local media markets. And we'll be able to support local press releases with text and quotes. So this is just to set the stage for that. It's only about a month away now. So that's the first public-facing announcement that we'll be making. And that's really just saying that you're interested in being involved, that you're signed on. There's no further action from you required to be mentioned in that press release at this time. So again, I will pause here for Q&A. Feel free to type any questions into the chat or unmute your microphone and ask them verbally if you'd rather. Okay, I'm going to assume everything is super clear and everyone's 100% on board, and just keep moving along then. So one last section from me, and then I'll hand you over to my colleague Kai to talk about measurement. But first I just want to, I did see the chat come in. Okay, so we have a question here. For setting 50% goals, does the scope need to be company-wide, or can we do a goal for a specific business unit or activity? I'm actually going to park that question and let Kai address that in the measurement section, because I think it will be well placed to be answered there. But we'll make sure to get back to that question, and please nudge us if we don't cover it, if we forget to cover it. But I think Kai will cover that in our measurement section. So reducing food loss and waste can be done. So looking here, this is a slide showing the reductions of just a handful of companies who have recently begun taking action to reduce food loss and waste within their operations. And you can see that some of them are having some pretty significant reductions over a span of just a few years. And this slide was put together last year, and if we did it this year, we'd have even stronger examples. But just to give a few examples of how this plays out. So Nestle had a 40% reduction in average of milk losses in transportation between 2017 and 2018. And what's really notable about this for me is that the reduced amount of food loss and waste was only 0.2%. So that's very small. So that means their initial losses were somewhere around 0.35%, 0.4%. But across 30 countries, even though that seems like a very small number percentage-wise, that ends up being over 10,000 tons of milk. The value of about $2.6 million and enough protein requirements for one day for over 11 million people. So the takeaway here is that you might already have pretty small percentage of food loss and waste occurring in your operations, but at a certain scale, that can still be very significant. An example from rice losses in Cameroon. So the company Olam handles a lot of rice in the rice supply chain in a number of countries, one of them being Cameroon. And they had a 36% reduction of food loss and waste in rice in just a year, which would end up being about 500 tons saved a year. And what was significant about this example to me is that the interventions they put in place were really very straightforward things. So it was things like making sure that bags get replaced when they're damaged, switching to new types of bags that are stronger, making sure to train staff in proper handling and loading procedures. So things that are all good business sense anyway, not really going out of your way to do something specifically for food loss and waste, but just things that are beneficial to your operations anyway. And then Campbell's is another company, the US manufacturing company, that has just started taking action in earnest on food loss and waste since 2017 and has already experienced a 36% reduction. And so this next slide shows that for them, it really has come down to taking action at many stages of the food supply chain. So in terms of avoiding food loss and waste at all, preventing it from occurring, you can see at the top here, they've said that they had bread that used to go to waste and now they're selling it to another company to make breadcrumbs. So not only are they preventing waste from occurring, they're creating new revenue. That they've also increased the amount of food that they donate annually, food valued at almost $60 million to support local food banks. And you can see other examples here. You'll be able to see this more in the slides when they're shared. But this is just to show that action really needs to take place throughout the entire operations, and it's unlikely you're going to find just one intervention that achieves the entire target. It's really about finding all of these smaller things that add up to a bigger whole. So this is the point where I end up doing a little math, and hopefully it won't be too daunting. But again, this is about setting the target and following the target. So the request when it comes to the target, just in terms of how we calculate it. So the target is to reduce food loss and waste in your operations by 50%. And so the indicator for that is food loss and waste as a percent of the product and ingredient handled by your organization. And so the calculation here is tons of food loss and waste over all tons produced or handled. So just to give an example here, Let's say that our friends at the XYZ Corporation are calculating their base year and they produced 100 tons of food in that year. Now, of that 100, 90 tons of food product were sold as intended, 5 tons were donated to food banks, and 5 tons left the human food supply chain. 3 of those tons went to animal feed, and 2 tons went to compost. So in their case, the total food loss and waste is just the 2 tons that went to compost, because for reasons that Kai will get into in the measurement portion, animal feed is not considered food loss and waste for the purposes of SDG 12.3. So their indicator calculation would be those 2 tons of compost divided by the 100 whole, or 2%. So their baseline would be 2% food loss and waste. So why is this the calculation? So why 50%? To be consistent with SDG 12.3, same with 2030. What base year should you be using? So 2020 is preferred if you have not begun taking action on food loss and waste yet. If you have solid data from an earlier year, you can use that. We're not trying to make anyone start over with a new baseline. Then finally, why the indicator? Why am I making you do math? Well, it's because SDG 12.3 for countries is a ratio, tons per capita. So we're adjusting that to reflect a business environment. So that's just taking into account the fact that, there are acquisitions, there are properties that you might sell off that will change your absolute figures, which is why this percentage is important for tracking progress over time. However, we'll say that it is important to capture data on an absolute basis, just tons, as well as tracking this normalized indicator. So I will pause there again. We'll get more into the specifics of that slide, but I'm happy to take any questions on that right now. So here's a question. How do we manage if our business model is based on the valorization of food loss from others? Do we also include our purchase in the calculation? Thanks. I might actually now introduce my colleague, Kai Robertson, who's going to be presenting the next section, and ask if Kai, hello Kai, good morning, if Kai has any thoughts on this question.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are around the world. Trying to unpack the question. So the focus, as I'll talk about in just a few minutes, is on your direct operations. So at least for the purposes of SDG 12.3 and the 50% reduction target. So it's what you have ownership of that you're trying to reduce and cut in half. If your business model is based on valorizing, say, food that goes to rendering, then the question that potentially that's one way to valorize food loss. You would be cutting in half the amount of loss that happens after the product has been handled by you. So I think that will become more clear as I go through my presentation, and happy to come back to this question if we need to. So maybe with that, I will take us down the path to talk about scope and what we mean when we're starting to measure, because what gets quantified takes a bit of unpacking, especially for those of you who are new to this topic. So I'm going to use for the next 20 or so minutes of our conversation, the Food Loss and Waste Accounting and Reporting Standard as the framework. And some of you may be familiar with this guide already. On the next slide, you'll see a picture of it on the right-hand side. This is a standard that was created in 2016 developed in collaboration with Consumer Goods Forum, along with some other business groups and food loss and waste experts, and as well as the United Nations agencies. And it received a lot of input from over 200 stakeholders, some of you on the phone, to make sure that it was really road tested and applicable around the world. The benefit of using this standard, if you're not familiar with it, is that it provides a common language and also a standardized way to summarize an FLW inventory. I'll dive into what we mean by a common language, because even though we often use the three words, food loss and waste, they can mean different things. The standard itself, if you've seen it, is a robust document only because there's a lot of guidance in it. There's a short 12-page executive summary that includes basically all you need to know, but there's a lot of additional guidance in the full standard and a lot of the companion documents. And all the related materials are on the flwprotocol.org website. There are case studies, a calculator, FAQs, as well as guidance on how to quantify. So we will talk about a lot of these other aspects in today and in future webinars, but you can also go right to the FLW protocol website to download really useful material. So with that as the source of our discussion, in the standard, there are 10 steps laid out that are generic steps in quantifying and reporting on the amount of food loss and waste. And today we'll focus on the one in red, circled in red, about establishing scope, but I'll quickly review these. As with many things, we start with defining the goals for why quantify in the first place. Brian mentioned SDG 12.3, so that target is in place for this initiative. What to quantify includes taking into account certain accounting and reporting principles and the scope. The why and the what do determine the how. And so the steps related to how to quantify, which will be in the future webinars Brian mentioned, cover the steps that you see in green. And then the next step is to report your information, to summarize what's been quantified. So again, as Brian mentioned, the recordings of these training modules will be available, and some prior ones are also on the Food Loss and Waste Protocol website already that are related to some specific situations. So in talking about, again, establishing scope, this third step, specifically, we want to talk about the common language and unpack that first. So when you look at the food supply chain, this is a very simplified visual. There are plants, fungi, and animals that are grown or reared, and from that we get food, which is the part that is intended to be consumed and eaten by people. And then there are typically some what you might call inedible parts, which is maybe the bones or the peel or the pit, and that's not typically intended in that cultural context or supply chain to be eaten by people. We are, for the purposes of food loss and waste, talking about what gets removed from the human food supply chain. So if it's consumed by people, as you see on the left side of the slide, that is still food consumed, whether it's goes through the donation route and is redistributed or is an alternative market. That's outside, not in the scope of food loss and waste. What might be possible food loss and waste is what you see here as the red arrow and the green arrow. We call those material types. So that could be food, which is not consumed, and or the associated inedible parts, the bones, skins, rinds. When they leave the human food supply chain, that's what the arrow indicates, is leaving the human food supply chain, they go to one of 10 possible destinations. These are in alphabetical order. So it could be anything from animal feed to bio-based material processing, anaerobic digestion, composting, on down the list. And we'll dive into this a bit more, so I won't read them all off right this moment. But the important thing to be clear on is when we're talking about what is included in an inventory, it's important to specify the material type and the destinations. The standard itself, as you see in the purple box, is agnostic on what you pick as material type and destinations to define food loss and waste. And very importantly, though, for the purposes of SDG 12.3 and for the 10 by 20 by 30 initiative, those material types and destinations have been chosen. And again, we'll get into that in just a few more minutes. So that's the basics of material types and destinations. In the next slide, you'll see, in addition to those two components of scope, there's also a time frame and the boundary. So let me actually start now from the left and go through these four in order. And this is what you'll be reporting on, and you should use as thinking about the scope of your food loss and waste inventory. So by time frame, this is really straightforward. What we mean by that is that you want to be clear on the period of time for which your business is reporting the data. And most businesses do report data over a 12-month period. So your measurement and reporting for 10 by 20 by 30 would be based on a 12-month level of food loss and waste. It could be any continuous 12-month period, so fiscal or calendar. And in addition, if the annual figure needs to be extrapolated from data derived over a shorter time period, you can do so, but remember that you should use a representative time period and adjust for any seasonality. So that's straightforward time frame. Material type, as I already just mentioned, there are two component possibilities. There's the food, and there are some inventories that include only food, the amounts that are intended for human consumption. Food includes drink. And then other inventories also, and most inventories actually also include the inedible parts. And most include both material types because simply it's often hard to remove and separate the amount of food and inedible parts. That's at least the case for retailers and for the food service sector. For manufacturers, this is sometimes a little easier to separate what is a food versus an inedible part. As you see an example of an apple, the core and the stem, it would most traditionally be considered an inedible part. In some cases, the skin could be also. Those percentages reflect the weight of those parts of the food from a USDA database. So when we're talking about material types, again, they could go to any one of the 10 destinations. I want to be clear on some commentary, on some language that gets in the way before we move to the destination. So in this next slide, you'll see that two pictures. One is what we would consider probably not very edible banana. It's the flesh of the banana that now looks inedible. But this is still food. So the top picture is food, no longer edible. It was intended for consumption, but it is no longer fit for consumption. That is very different from the inedible part, which is, you see here, is a banana skin. So it's important if you introduce the word inedible to be super clear about whether you're talking about the parts or the food that's no longer fit for consumption. So we want to make sure that, again, the food does not equal, inedible food is not the same thing as inedible parts. And you'll see that when we click through to show that, again, inedible parts are what's not intended for consumption. So just, again, this may be important for your business. Just be crystal clear about when you're talking about parts versus food. And there's additional guidance that RAP has created for some examples of crop types and their inedible parts, which if you're operating at field level, again, becomes sometimes important to distinguish. So just to sum this up, in terms of what we mean by material type, it's any plant-based items, animal-based items. It is not mud or stones that may be attached to a product, say potatoes. Out of scope is any water added. Also out of scope is any kind of straw or plant material. Those are not considered part of what might be food loss or waste. So now the destinations, which I've mentioned. And I'm seeing a question come up that asks, why is apple skin considered inedible? So let me go back to that just to be clear. Maybe Brian, just go back to that slide for a second. So inedibility varies by culture and supply chain. So I personally would not consider the skin inedible because I eat the skin. There may be a business, however, which removes the skin as part of its processing, and for the purposes of its operations and supply chain, the skin is considered an inedible part. It's not intended for humans to be eaten, and so it is quantified separately. Now, we can probably have an hour-long conversation about what is an inedible part versus food. And frankly, in developing the standard, it took us a 3-month discussion to be clear, what do we mean by food? But the food part is clear, and that's intended for human consumption. And its intentionality, though, that's subjective. So if, in many cases, what we learned even in developing the standard is you could hypothetically probably eat everything that comes attached to a food product. Even in a cow, hooves are eaten in some parts of the world. So to be the most important thing is to be clear about whether or not you have included both material types, or if you have excluded the inedible parts. And if you have excluded the inedible parts, then it really matters to define what is inedible. If you're including both material types in your inventory, then the distinction of what is food versus what is inedible part is less important. And the reason both food and inedible parts are included and part of the SDG 12.3 target is because, and I'll talk about this again later too, but just to bring it up right now, is that target 12.3 comes under SDG 12, which is about sustainable consumption and production. And so it's about resource use efficiency as well. And when an apple is grown and if you're not utilizing all parts of it, but you're trying to focus on more sustainable consumption and production, you want to be looking at best optimizing the resource use of all parts, whether, again, you consider them intended for people to eat or not intended. So that's a detailed answer. So let me go back to the more high-level review now of what we mean by destinations, the second part of the scope. So we've got these material types. They leave the human food supply chain, and the destinations are where these material types go when they are removed from the food supply chain and are not consumed by people. Again, for the standard, we made this list alphabetical, but not all destinations are created equal. Some do have higher associated impacts or higher value than others, as you saw in Brian's showing the inverted pyramid. Destinations like landfill controlled combustion tend to be less preferred options, and the higher valorized options are the two on the top, animal feed and bio-based material and processing. This next slide shows you the definition of each of these, and I won't go into reading all of this, but do want to call out, first of all, this is all in the Food Loss and Waste Accounting and Reporting Standard, so you can look that up very quickly on the website. The two that Brian had mentioned already are, that we'll talk about again in just a second, some more are animal feed, which is about diverting material from the food supply chain, either directly or after processing to animals. That could be either diverting material to pet food or to zoo animals, or different, again, sources of, or different types of animals that may go back into the human food supply chain or might not be used again for humans. The bio-based materials biochemical processing destination is about converting material into industrial products. Most commonly, that is also considered rendering. So where you might render products into raw material to make soap or make a biodiesel or make something like cosmetics. And then the other destinations are pretty self-explanatory: anaerobic digestion, composting, controlled combustion, which is incineration, land application, landfill. The not harvested plowed in destination is about leaving crops that were ready for harvest in the field or tilling them into the soil. And then you've got some items where there's no management, so it's refuse or material that goes down the drain, that's sewer and wastewater treatment. So as we go, linking this all to 10 by 20 by 30, so the suggested interpretation of time frame, material type, and destinations is as you see here. So the 50% reduction target that Brian's been referencing applies to both the food and the associated inedible parts. And again, this is the interpretation by for SDG 12.3. It's an interpretation that was developed by Champions 12.3, the group of senior leaders and executives around the world, where Brian mentioned a lot of executives are part of that. And that definition and interpretation has been the same interpretation as what FAO is using, what the European Commission has adopted. And so again, because SDG 12.3 comes under the goal of sustainable consumption and production, both material parts are included. So it's about food security as well as resource use efficiency. Now, an important note, again, as I was referencing this, if you can separate food and inedible parts, you'll see on the bottom of this slide on the right, an important note that if you are able to separate those amounts and quantify them separately, you can do so, and you could apply the 50% reduction target only to the food portion that leaves the human food supply chain. And this flexibility recognizes that for some companies, a significant share of your food loss and waste may be the associated inedible parts, maybe bones or feathers or other byproducts. So therefore, if you want to leave inedible parts out of your 50% reduction target, you can do so, but you need to be able to quantify those separately. And we recognize that cutting in half the amount of inedible parts can be more difficult to achieve than having the amount of food due to physical, cultural, or other regulatory limitations. In terms of the destinations that count, as you'll see, there's a check mark against 8 of them. So the consensus is that what we're going to call food loss and waste and cut in half is what the material that goes to 8 of the possible destinations. So as you can see, it excludes the animal feed and the bio-based materials, biochemical processing. As Brian mentioned earlier, that's how Campbell reports on its data. And there are a few reasons why these 2 destinations are excluded. One of the primary reasons for excluding them is that those using inedible parts to make animal feed or to make non-food industrial products is in many cases the most efficient use and the highest value use of those materials. So again, to be clear, in those cases where food does go to those 2 destinations, specifically for the purpose of SDG 12.3, that is not considered food loss and waste. But the recommendation, and it's a strong recommendation, is nonetheless do track the amounts going to those destinations. Do track what goes to animal feed. Do track what goes to bio-based material, biochemical processing, because in your particular business, there may very well be opportunity and possibly significant opportunity to save food from going to either of those 2 destinations and then recapturing what could be lost revenue. And again, just a quick comment to say that this recommendation on scope is consistent with the approach proposed by FAO and the European Commission for country-level reporting. For anybody, a couple asterisks in that if anybody does follow the work of the European Commission and FAO closely, you might notice that those 2 organizations exclude the not harvested and plowed in destination, but that's simply due to a lack of data to track at the country level and some regulatory constraints. But both FAO and the EU, as well as others, recognize the importance of this destination as well. And a number of studies indicate that there may be a lot of loss and waste going to not harvested or being plowed under. And so it's important, and 10 by 20, to track it, to reduce it, and 10 by 20 by 30 includes the destination of not harvested, plowed in as well. Another asterisk and comment that often comes up is a question about destinations like anaerobic digestion and compost that create valuable outputs. So definitely agree that there are valuable outputs from composting and AD, but it's considered a food loss and waste for the purpose of SDG 12.3 because there are more efficient ways to generate that end use. So for example, if you wanted to generate energy and bioenergy, there are more efficient ways to do so than growing a bunch of food, incurring the energy and other resource costs embedded in growing that food and distributing it and processing it and then burning it. So again, we're just saying cut in half the amounts that goes to those destinations, not eliminate them. So it's still really important to provide a higher value destination, but the compost and AD are in scope. So this next slide will show a bit more about what I mean about the valorization of these destinations. So when we're talking about the hierarchy of destinations for achieving, again, specifically the SDG target 12.3, which is the goal that will be used to track progress for 10 by 20 by 30, you look at these boxes that are circled in red as those that do not contribute to meeting SDG 12.3. This is the waste stream to be reduced by 50%, with either a red box, no valorization, or an orange box, has some valorization. You want to move material out of the red and orange boxes. A simple way to show that is in this next slide, that we basically, how do we reach the 50% reduction target? Move material from the red and orange destinations, and first try to keep food from leaving the food supply chain. So you see an arrow coming up here from red, orange to dark green. That's step one. Keep food feeding people is basically the philosophy. So keep food in the food supply chain and avoid it from going to the red or orange destinations. However, point two is if that's not possible, then the next step is to aim for higher valorization. So you'll see this next arrow showing that the second option is where possible, if you can't keep food in the food supply chain for whatever reason, then aim for higher valorization, move the red-orange material, what's in those boxes now, and cut that in half by either, again, sending it to dark green or sending it to light green to animal feed, bio-based material processing. Super simplified slide of what I've just described is now, as you can see here, again, arrows going, if you just go click one more slide, we'll see that's the very simple view of what we're trying to achieve through a 10 by 20 by 30. One aspect that has come up, and I'll just address it now briefly, and we can talk about it if people have questions, is there are companies who have already taken significant steps and are close to meeting this SDG target 12.3 and have cut in half the material that goes from the red and orange boxes, and there's very little left there. So there is an opportunity that we're still refining a bit to also add an extra stretch target, a complementary target that would be focused on moving and keeping what goes to animal feed and bio-based material processing, keeping any food that goes there also within the food supply chain. So if your situation is such that you've perhaps already been close to meeting SDG target 12.3, and there's an opportunity to keep food in the food supply chain and not go to animal feed or to rendering either, then we could be considering an optional and an additive target about those two destinations, and we can certainly talk to any company interested in that as we go through this process of working together. A boundary. So there is one more section on scope that I haven't yet touched on, but it's pretty straightforward. So we'll not be spending as much time as I just did on material type and destinations, but it is important to understand what's meant by boundary. So the recommended calculation boundaries for 10 by 20 by 30 are your direct operations. So those operations owned by your company. And for 10 by 20 by 30, the suppliers again are asked to report against their entire operations. To the person's question earlier, if there are reasons that you need to exclude an operation, whether it's a joint venture or a new acquisition, or the data for some reason is just really impossible to get in the first year, or it's just it's not a food product line. It's a product line, a division that you own that doesn't really handle much food, then certainly you might need to exclude those. The key is to be clear about any divisions that you have excluded, and people so people know what is in scope and what's been excluded and why. And that's what these 4 items underneath boundary really cover. So in food category, what you want to report there is all food categories that are relevant to your direct operations. Be clear whether we're measuring dairy, milk products, or meat or produce. Again, that's important for the user to understand what is in the boundary and in scope, because that also does affect the weight. Report on the life cycle stage. Again, it's meant to be your direct operations, so that's already been predetermined. But what might be in your direct operation, there might be some questions you have. So it's, again, all your sites operated by your company, whether it's a pack house in a source or a receiving country. It's the food rejects that are owned by your company. It's any food loss and waste that occurs during the transport of your owned product. And this last line tells you that this is not intended to include the FLW generated at one of your upstream supplier sites or other stages in your supply chain. that's still really important to understand what food loss and waste might be happening upstream and downstream from your operations, but simply for the purpose of the 50% reduction target and what you're reporting on for 10 by 20 by 30, it's your direct operations. But definitely do have conversations up and downstream and be thinking about how what you might do could impact food loss and waste outside your own direct operations. In terms of geography, it's straightforward to include all geographic regions that are relevant. And also from an organization perspective, it's important to be clear about how many facilities you've included in your inventory so that you know when somebody looks at your inventory, they know if there's been 100 facilities. There's an example in the bottom here that'll show up in a minute. You have 100 facilities, of which 90 are manufacturing sites and 10 distribution centers. Being clear here, it just helps people understand, again, the context of how much is included. And if you need to exclude aspects, as I mentioned, you can reference here what's been excluded. So those were the 4 components of scope: timeframe, material type, destination, and boundary. There are some related issues. I will not get into much detail here, but we can go back if you have questions, or you can email us directly too. But probably stating the obvious that packaging and other non-FLW material should be excluded from your inventory, and there's guidance on the protocol website about how to do so if you can't easily subtract the weight of packaging from the weight of FLW. You should not include any water that's been added for cleaning or any water that's been removed from the food loss and waste to, say, dehydrate the product, just so that you can store the food loss and waste, to dehydrate the food loss and waste. So again, the food loss and waste that you report on should be reflecting the state in which the food loss and waste was generated before you added any water to clean or before you removed any water of the food loss and waste for perhaps storage reasons. And there's guidance in chapter 6 of the standard on this as well. And then if you are quantifying at the agricultural level, losses that take place before harvest are excluded from the scope of an inventory. You certainly may want to quantify those, but you should keep the data separate because the definition of food loss and waste starts when a product is ready for harvest or slaughter. And again, there's more guidance on that in the standard itself. So some examples now to bring this all together. This is an example from one of Tesco's suppliers called G's Fresh Food. And as you can see here, they reported that in their inventory, the time frame was 12 months. They specifically quantified the food components because they were able to exclude or didn't have inedible parts relevant in their business. And you'll see in the destinations, there are check marks to indicate that their inventory covers the 8 destinations that are in scope. But some of them are in a yellow box, in a yellow check. And the yellow check is simply to say that that destination, like landfill, is in scope, but they had no food waste going to those destinations. And so there's a visual like this you can replicate and use yourself to be clear which destinations you include and which may have no food waste going to them. So you can indicate that with a different colored check mark. And then the boundary, you can see, as we were just talking about, the food category, what they've included is fresh salads and vegetables. Their stage is direct operations. Geography was the UK and Spain, and that the organization was the entire G's Fresh business. And when you then report on your data, there's a really simple way that many of the suppliers to Tesco have actually been reporting, and this has been adopted as well by the UK Food Waste Reduction Roadmap. So for any of you operating in the UK, you may have been using this format already. And what's valuable with this slide is just to see that an example of a company that's been able to report, measure, and then reports their data publicly. So you can see on the left is the inventory from 2017 and 2018, and they show the total amount of food that's been produced or handled. And the 14.5% figure you see there was their waste as a percentage in the initial year. And then if you look to the right, you'll see there's a waste as a percentage of production is 11.3%. And that represents a 22% reduction from one year to the next. And this percentage figure is what Brian was talking about, the calculation. That's the figure that will be tracked to be able to say that by 2030, that 10 by 20 by 30 participants have been able to achieve collectively a 50% reduction. So in this case, this was already a 22% reduction over the span of 1 year. As importantly, you'll see the pie charts where GES has been able to report the waste by destination, breaks it down for those 8 destinations, and also an optional additional useful piece of information they share is the waste by category. So for them, it's by mushrooms versus vegetables, salads, etc. And again, this is all just to show you that this is being done already by a number of companies. Another example, just again to show that there are different permutations on this, is by Cranswick, who's in the meat business. And on this next slide, you'll see that there's a blue pie chart, the waste by destination on the right, and all of their food loss and waste only goes to anaerobic digestion. So their check marks for what destinations are in scope would look different. They do also, as do other companies, track and report again the amounts going to animal feed and bio-based material processing, and they've reported that in the Food Waste Atlas. So again, just an example of a company that's been reporting publicly. They've also seen a 20% reduction from 1 year to the next. And my second to last slide, before we go over to Q&A again, is that this reflects what Brian has mentioned as well, and it's a summary of the recommendations on what to measure and report for 10 by 20 by 30. So what's being asked for 10 by 20 by 30 is to report your overall tonnage, the weight, and the absolute amount of food loss and waste. What we're going to track to look to for the 50% reduction is the second item, the tons of FLW as a percent of tons produced, where again produced is defined below, and we'll go more into that when we talk about reporting in future webinars as well. We want to report the food loss and waste amount by destination, and as you saw for the 2 company examples on the prior slides, and then also separately report on the amount of surplus food we distributed, whether it's to charities or commercial organizations. Food donation is clearly an important action taken to keep food in the food supply chain, but it is still food, and so it's nonetheless useful to track. It's just not considered food waste. And then you also want to separately track the amount diverted to animal feed, indoor bio-based material. As we discussed before, that there still might be opportunity to significantly keep food out of those two destinations for some organizations. And we also want, in the next set of bullets, you'll see to clearly define a report on your scope using the standard, as well as reporting on the methods and assumptions that underlie your quantification. And as an optional best practice step on the bottom of the slide, you can report the food loss and waste tonnage by the key product categories, and also where it's applicable, provide details of any assurance you may have undertaken, whether it's a peer review or a site audit, as that does enhance the confidence in your quantification. It's okay, of course, obviously, if you haven't gotten to that step and if you're still working with initial estimates. Many companies start out with imperfect data and just improve it over time. That is perfectly fine. And then last but not least, this slide shows you where a lot of the resources might be available. If you haven't already gone out to the Food Loss and Waste Protocol website, you can translate the data, the information easily. Some of it's already been translated, like the executive summary and the standard itself, and there's a lot of guidance on reporting and quantification and other tools and resources, as well as case studies. With that, I will turn it back over to Brian and more Q&A.
Thank you, Kai. I think that was really detailed and helpful, so thank you. And thank you all for sticking with us for this whole 90-minute session. We've got 15 minutes left. And so I saw there was at least one question that came through while you were presenting, Kai. So I'll ask that, and then maybe that'll give a chance if anyone else has questions. So Kai, the question was, does non-edible parts include crop residue from harvest? So part of the plant, but not part of the fruit. So we have programs to reduce waste for GHG reductions reasons, so we do have programs to reduce waste for GHG reduction reasons, but it is not food. So does it include those that crop residue?
Right, so in most cases, the crop residue, so like rice stalks, would be considered part of plant material, but not part of what is in the food supply chain. So not a food and not an inedible part, but rather plant material. So, and those are, plant material could very well have a lot of value, whether it's, being plowed back into the soil or burned or used for other purposes, not burned, but well, possibly burned for bioenergy purposes. But there definitely there's value in the crop residue, but those may be outside the food supply chain. Again, depends a little bit on the category we're talking about, but it's important, again, to be clear on what you've excluded if you've made some assumptions. So for instance, there's guidance, as I mentioned, that RAP has created about some produce categories in particular when you've got like the outer leaves of lettuce or other parts of a plant that may be left in the field and are never traditionally, they're considered just plant material, not food or inedible parts. Another question that's come up.
Yes, the question is, how would you recommend dealing with water contained in milk? Would this be considered part of the food?
So yes, the inherent intrinsic water weight of a product is considered food because it's a liquid product. And yes, that makes therefore an inventory of dairy, say, be heavier in weight than a comparable product that has a much lower lower amount of intrinsic water weight, which is why it's important to be clear about what food category has been included in your inventory. That said, again, getting into the weeds just a little bit, in the UK, where there's a lot of measurement has been taking place so far, there is a UK food waste reduction roadmap, and for dairy specifically, there are some recommendations about dairy processing in particular, and considering reporting in, so recording and estimating the tons of milk, but then also the tons of milk equivalent, which is a specific approach that applies specifically to dairy. And so if that's something that you're interested in, we can point you to where RAP has included some more guidance specific to the dairy sector. So you may, for your business, want to convert milk to milk equivalents as well, so you can compare perhaps one facility or business unit to another. But for the purposes of the standard, we're saying report in terms of total tons. And again, tons and then the percent of production or handling.
Great, thank you, Kai. Any other questions, anyone? And again, feel free to reach out to us directly by email as well. I'll put my email address into the chat again so that you have that. There we go. All right, well, I'm not seeing any further questions coming through. So just to give you the next steps, we will, before the end of the month, share the slides and the recordings from the webinar. But again, feel free to reach out if you would like those sooner. And we will, in that message, can send you some information about our next webinar as well, where we'll get into those quantification methods in greater detail. And we'll also provide some information about the September 24th announcement. So I think with that, we can wrap up the discussion for today. Thank you all so much for joining. We had a great turnout today. We had wonderful questions. We can tell that people are very engaged and interested. So thank you for your interest. Please do not hesitate to reach out if you have any questions any sooner. Oh, here comes one last question. Hi, Brian, just to be sure, I was wondering if this initiative is only for food-related suppliers. Yes, this is specifically focused on food-related suppliers and food-related businesses. So it's all about food loss and waste reduction specifically. So thank you for joining. And again, send us an email if you have any questions before you hear from us next. And we look forward to working with you on this wonderful initiative. So thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to join, and we will be in touch very soon.